Friday but false on Saturday. For God to know this truth, it seems he must be located at the temporal indexical now, which contradicts the claim that he is timeless. Proponents of atemporality respond by arguing that God knows all such truths under their eternal, non-indexical descriptions, e.g., on December 13, 2024, it is Friday, or that God's knowledge is a direct awareness of reality itself, not of propositions, and thus is not subject to the shifting truth values of tense sentences. Point 4. The core of this entire discussion revolves around a subtle but critical distinction between causal determination and explanatory certainty. The objection to foreknowledge implicitly assumes that God's knowledge is a cause that determines future events. The atemporal response reframes God's knowledge as a perfect, infallible effect or reflection of the entire causal tapestry of reality, a tapestry that includes genuinely free human choices. From God's eternal vantage point, the outcome of a free choice is certain and known, but this certainty does not negate the fact that, within the temporal sequence, the event is brought about by the agent's free will. This distinction is paramount for understanding how an unmanageable time can be both a product of contingent, free choices and yet simultaneously a known and certain element within the eternal mind of God. His knowledge doesn't force the crisis, it comprehends it. Section 3. Omnipotence and the logic of divine power. The concept of divine omnipotence, or God's attribute of being all-powerful, is fundamental to theism and directly impacts the question of why an all-powerful being would permit the existence of suffering, chaos, and unmanageable times. Point 7. Omnipotence is generally defined as the possession of unlimited power, the ability to do whatever God wills, consistent with his own perfect nature. Point 18. This power is not a blind force but is exercised with intelligent purpose and perfect wisdom, and it is universal in its scope, extending to every aspect of creation. Point 17. However, the simple phrase, all-powerful, has generated significant philosophical debate, crystallized in the classic omnipotence paradox. The paradox of the stone. The most famous formulation of the omnipotence paradox is the question, can God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? Point 28. This question is designed to be a logical trap. If the answer is yes, then there is something God cannot but lift the stone, so he is not omnipotent. If the answer is no, then there is something God cannot but create the stone, so he is not omnipotent. Point 28. Either way, the attribute of omnipotence appears to be self-contradictory and thus logically incoherent. The primary resolution, logical possibility. The standard and most widely accepted resolution to this paradox, dating back to thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, is to define omnipotence not as the ability to do anything that can be expressed in words, but as the ability to do anything that is logically possible. Point 7. The ability to perform a logical contradiction, such as creating a square circle, or a married bachelor, is not a power at all, it is an absurdity. A phrase like, "a stone so heavy that an omnipotent being cannot lift it," is a self-contradictory and meaningless string of words. 28 It describes a conceptual incoherence, not a genuine task. Therefore, when theologians state that God cannot perform such an action, they are not placing a limit on his power. Rather, they are affirming the perfect coherence and rationality of his power. As Aquinas argued, it is better to say that such things cannot be done, than that God cannot do them, because they do not have the nature of a feasible or possible thing to begin with. 32 The paradox dissolves because it asks God to violate the very law of non-contradiction that makes reality intelligible. Omnipotence and divine nature. This understanding of omnipotence is further refined by the principle that God's power operates in a way that is consistent with his own perfect nature. 18 Scripture itself indicates things God cannot do. He cannot lie. Titus 1:2 He cannot sin, and he cannot deny himself. 2 Timothy 2:13.18 These are not deficiencies in his power but affirmations of his perfect moral character. An inability to be unloving, unjust, or untruthful is a feature of perfection, not a limitation. God's omnipotence is the power to bring about any state of affairs that is both logically possible and consistent with his holy and good nature. He has power over his power, meaning it is always directed by his wise and holy will, not an uncontrollable force. 26 Omnipotence and free will. A crucial aspect of God's omnipotence is his ability to exercise sovereign self-limitation. 26 In creating a world with agents who possess genuine free will, God omnipotently chooses to permit a sphere of creaturely freedom. He does not constantly exercise his power to coerce every outcome, which would render free will illusory. This concept is central to the free will defense against the problem of evil. 24 This defense argues that God, in his goodness, created free beings because a world with genuine freedom, love, and moral goodness is better than a world of automata. The tragic but unavoidable consequence of this gift of freedom is the possibility of its misuse, leading to sin and suffering, the very source of life's unmanageable moments. God's omnipotence is not thwarted by evil. Rather, the existence of evil is a consequence of how God has chosen to exercise his omnipotence in creating a world with free beings. The coherence of the human experience of crisis is deeply dependent on this understanding of omnipotence. If God's power were arbitrary and could violate logic, as René Descartes speculated 31, then the universe would be fundamentally unintelligible. In such a world, concepts like cause and effect, choice and consequence, would have no stable meaning. An event could be both manageable and unmanageable at the same time. The very idea of an unmanageable time presupposes a stable, ordered reality in which actions have predictable, even if undesirable, consequences. This order is grounded in the logical and moral consistency of God's own nature. Therefore, the painful reality of a crisis is possible only because God's omnipotence is rational and consistent, not because it is deficient. The crisis is real because God's order is real. Part 2. The existential locus. Human experience and divine providence. Having established the metaphysical framework of God's relationship to time, knowledge, and power, the analysis now shifts to the human side of the query. This part examines the lived experience of temporality in crisis, connecting these existential realities to the theological concepts of divine providence and order. It is here that the abstract nature of God intersects with the concrete, often painful, reality of life's experience. Section 4. The human experience of time and crisis. The human condition is defined by its immersion in time. This temporal existence has a distinct character, one marked by succession, transience, and a fundamental sense of incompleteness, which, under pressure, can collapse into a state of acute crisis or unmanageability. The fleeting and incomplete nature of human time. Human consciousness operates as a stream, a continuous flow of successive experiences. Point 3 we exist as beings passing along a one-way temporal dimension, unable to pause, reverse, or step outside of its relentless progression. Point 9 This mode of being generates a profound and inescapable sense of loss. As the philosopher Brian Lefko notes, a temporal being is unable to enjoy what is past or future for it. The past is lost forever, and no memory, however vivid, can substitute for its actuality. The future, meanwhile, is yet to come and is not truly possessed. Point 9 This incompleteness of temporal life is a fundamental feature of our existence. We experience life sequentially, moment by moment, which renders our possession of it inherently spread out and diffuse. Point 4 Our conscious minds are, in a sense, trapped in linear time, able to grasp only the present sliver of a much larger reality. Point 3-4 This metaphysical condition has deep psychological consequences. It is the source of anxiety about the future and regret over the past. The constant gnawing of times 2-9 means that our projects are fragile, our relationships are finite, and our control is always partial. For much of life, this background reality is managed through routine, planning, and the illusion of control. A crisis, however, is when this illusion shatters. The theology of unmanageability. In modern pastoral and therapeutic contexts, particularly within recovery programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, this moment of crisis is given a specific name, the point where life becomes unmanageable. Point 35 This is the admission of utter powerlessness over a destructive pattern, be it addiction, sin, or overwhelming circumstances. Point 37 Theologically, this is a moment of profound significance. It is described as the entryway for our life with God. Point 35 This state of acknowledging one's unmanageable life is directly equated with the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matt. 5. 3.35 to be, or in spirit, is to recognize one's own spiritual bankruptcy and complete dependence on a power greater than oneself. The crisis, therefore, is not merely a negative event, it is a catalyst. It is the force that breaks down the pride and self-sufficiency that act as barriers to grace. 35 It is in the confession of weakness that divine power is made perfect. 9.35 This moment of surrender, of admitting that one's own resources are exhausted and one's plans have led to ruin, creates the necessary space for divine intervention and transformation. It is the turning point from relying on a failing human will to relying on the unfailing sovereignty of God. From personal chaos to divine order. This personal journey from crisis to surrender mirrors a grand cosmic and biblical narrative, the movement from chaos to divine order. The very first verses of Genesis describe God's creative act as bringing order, light, and structure out of a world that was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. 39 The entire biblical story can be read as God's ongoing work to restore order to a world thrown into chaos by human sin. This culminates in the doctrine of eschatology.